Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
I am so excited to jump into this deep dive today because the material is just incredibly rich.
It really is. I was thinking about this, and it is incredibly easy to take for granted how we navigate the world today. I mean, if you need to drive across a massive, unfamiliar city, there's just this underlying expectation of complete visibility.
Oh, absolutely. Like, you don't even stress about it.
Right. You just pull up the GPS on your phone and boom, you instantly have this satellite feed of your reality. You see the glowing blue dot that represents you, and the exact route is just mapped out in this solid blue line.
And it even gives you the red patches for traffic delays miles ahead.
Exactly. You don't even have to think about it. The app just dictates turn right in 500 feet, and you blindly trust it because, you have the whole picture handed to you in one unified view.
It's a really profound psychological comfort, honestly. You're operating with this top-down, almost omniscient perspective of your environment. I mean, there's literally no guesswork.
Zero guesswork. But if you step back in time, even just 100 years, navigation wasn't like that at all. You were constantly dealing with this really fragmented landscape.
Oh, yeah. You'd be unfolding those massive paper maps in the front seat.
Yeah, or you just ask a local at a gas station, right? And he give you some highly subjective landmark, something like turn left at the old oak tree that got struck by lightning last year.
Which is terribly unhelpful if you're not from there.
Right. And then you'd consult that tattered, hand-drawn paper map that, only showed half the county and completely lacked any topographical depth. You were just always piecing together these partial clues.
You're just hoping all those disparate pieces of direction would eventually coalesce, right?
Yeah.
And actually lead you to the right destination.
Exactly. You had glimpses of the truth, but you never had the entire map.
Which is basically like navigating through muddy waters. I mean, you had light to see by, certainly, but it was scattered. It was totally piecemeal.
So why are we talking about GPS and old maps?
Well, because that transition, moving from relying on those scattered, fragmented clues to suddenly being handed the ultimate complete map of reality, that is the precise psychological shift we are exploring today.
Yes, because today we are diving deep into the profound ancient wisdom found in the biblical book of Hebrews, specifically looking at the opening 2 chapters.
And the author of this text is, he's basically attempting to take his readers on this massive cognitive journey. He wants to move them from an age of fragmented glimpses of the divine into the ultimate unified truth.
But to really grasp the weight of this, I think we need to completely immerse ourselves in the historical and human context. Because, this isn't just some abstract philosophical essay written in a vacuum.
Not at all. The original audience for this letter, which was Jewish Christians living in the first century, they were living through an absolute crushing crisis of faith.
And it's hard for a modern listener to really fathom the immense social pressure these specific people were under.
It really is. These were individuals who had embraced the new path, right? The message of the gospel of Jesus. But following that path in the first century wasn't just some casual weekend commitment.
No, it was costing them everything. They were facing severe persecution, the confiscation of their actual property, public mocking, and just intense social ostracization.
And because of that intense suffering, they were facing a very real, very seductive temptation. The temptation to just abandon this new, incredibly difficult road and relapse entirely into the familiarity of the ancient Jewish system.
I mean, put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine the sensory and cultural pull of what they had just left behind. The Jewish religious system wasn't some minor local club. Yep. It had centuries of undeniable antiquity.
It was the bedrock of their entire civilization.
Exactly. It had these breathtakingly imposing rites. You had the architectural wonder of the temple in Jerusalem, the smell of the incense, the heritage of the priesthood.
The daily sacrifices that literally structured the rhythm of their lives.
Yeah, and the sheer weight of public sentiment. It was this undisputed, divinely originated system that their ancestors had literally bled for. So to walk away from that cultural bedrock for a new movement that's currently just bringing them pain.
The gravity pulling them backward must have felt absolutely inescapable. And what is so fascinating about the author's strategy here, starting right in the opening sentences, is that he doesn't actually attack their old beliefs.
Right, he doesn't say, oh, the old system was bad or demonic.
No, he validates it. He confirms that it was real, but then he systematically demonstrates how that old system has been completely eclipsed by something infinitely greater.
He wants to prove that if they turn back to the shadows now, they aren't just returning to a comfortable cultural tradition. They are turning their backs on the ultimate revelation of reality.
Which brings us to the core wisdom we are going to trace through this entire discussion today.
Yeah, the ultimate aha moment of these chapters, which is that the ultimate message of truth doesn't just come from a supreme seer who sits, completely detached in the cosmos, just shouting instructions down at us.
Right. It comes from a supreme source, the sun, who literally condescended to our exact human level. He entered into the dirt, the blood, and the tears.
Specifically to rescue humanity from its deepest, most paralyzing, unspoken anxiety, which is the fear of death, but we'll get to that.
We will definitely get to that. But first, the author has to establish absolute authority. In the opening verses of Hebrews chapter 1, he sets up this masterful contrast regarding how humans receive divine communication.
The text states that God, who in the past spoke to the fathers by the prophets at sundry times and in diverse manners, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son.
I love the old phrasing of that. Sundry times and in diverse manners.
It sounds so poetic, right? But it's actually pointing to a very fragmented reality, like we were talking about with the maps.
Exactly. The Greek phrasing there is incredibly precise. Sundry times is plumacious, which means in many parts or in many portions, and diverse manners is polytropous, meaning in many ways.
So the author's freely admitting that the ancient revelation their ancestors relied on was entirely legitimate. God truly did speak.
But the delivery method was piecemeal. It was fractured. A piece of truth was given through a mysterious dream to one person in the desert, another piece through a burning bush.
Another piece through poetic psalms, another through rigid legal codes, and another through the rise and fall of empires. It was scattered.
And one of our sources uses an analogy for this progression of revelation that completely clicked for me. It compares this historical progression to a sunrise.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Imagine standing outside in the pitch black right before dawn. Under the ancient prophets, revelation was like that very first faint breaking of light on the eastern horizon.
Right. You look out and the darkness just starts to recede a tiny bit.
Yeah, you have enough light to know you aren't completely blind. And you start to make out the obscure, gray, undefined outlines of the objects around you. Like, a shape is a tree or a mountain, but you can't see the texture of the bark or the colors of the leaves at all.
The shadows are still incredibly long at that point. The true detailed nature of the landscape remains totally hidden, even though you technically aren't in absolute darkness anymore. You have truth, but it's incomplete.
But then the coming of the sun is described not just as, a little more light, but as the sun itself cresting the horizon and rising in full orb, blinding glory at high noon.
Suddenly, you see the brilliant greens, the deep blues, the exact proportions.
The shadows just disappear, and the depth of the world is perfectly illuminated. So the author's contrast isn't between bad ancient revelation and good new revelation. It's between a partial, fragmented glimpse of the divine and the ultimate, unified, brilliant truth.
And to prove that this unified truth is, in fact, the ultimate reality, the author immediately launches into this incredibly dense theological unpacking of the sun's identity.
Yeah, in just the first 3 verses, he stacks 7 majestic cosmic descriptors of the sun. And these are not just poetic flourishes meant to sound pretty.
No, there are massive worldview-altering claims about the nature of the universe.
Let's walk through those 7 descriptors slowly because, if we rush past them, we miss the entire foundation of his argument. Okay, number 1, the text calls him the heir of all things.
And in the ancient Near Eastern world, the concept of an heir was loaded with absolute authority. The heir is the one who ultimately possesses the entire estate, right? The one for whom the estate exists.
So the author is claiming that the vastness of creation, like the entire universe and everything in it, is his rightful inheritance. It all points to him.
Which leads right into the second descriptor. He is the creator of the worlds. And what blew my mind in the research is the specific word used for worlds here. It's the Greek word aisho.
Oh, I was reading about that. That is a crucial distinction.
It really is. Ice can refer to the physical universe, the spatial reality of stars and planets, but its primary meaning often relates to the ages or the epochs of time itself.
Wait, so the claim is that the sun didn't just sculpt the physical matter of the planets, but he authored the very dimension of time.
Exactly. The progression of history, the unfolding of eras. He is the literal architect of it all.
He didn't just put the actors on the stage. He built the stage and wrote the timeline of the play. That is wild.
And then the text moves from his relationship with the universe to his intimate, intrinsic relationship with God the Father. Descriptors 3 and 4 are where the philosophy gets incredibly deep.
Yeah, number 3 says he is the brightness of God's glory.
The Greek word there is apogasma. It translates to reflected splendor, or, more accurately, the light which actively emanates from a luminous body.
So if God the Father is the infinite, unapproachable, luminous body, the Son is the actual radiation.
Precisely. He is the light that travels and makes that body known to us.
Returning to our sun analogy, we literally cannot look directly at the physical body of the sun. If we try, we blind ourselves. It is too intense, too other.
But we intimately know the sun through its beams.
Right. The rays that travel 93 million miles through the freezing vacuum of space to hit our skin, to warm the earth, to illuminate our mornings, that is the brightness of the sun. We experience the star entirely through its radiance.
And the text is arguing that the sun is that exact radiance. He is the emanation of the divine that humans can actually perceive and experience without being consumed.
Which is a beautiful thought. And the fourth descriptor anchors that thought even firmer. It says, he is the express image of his person. The Greek word the author chooses here is character.
Which is literally where we get our English word character.
In the ancient world, character originally referred to a heavy engraving tool, right? And eventually it came to mean the exact physical impression made by that specific tool.
Exactly. Think of a heavy metal signet ring and a pool of hot wax. A king in the ancient world would press his ring into the wax to seal an official document.
And when the ring is pulled away, the wax bears the exact, perfect, unchangeable imprint of the metal stamp.
Every microscopic line, every detail of the crest, every groove is perfectly and inversely replicated in the wax. The author is saying the sun is the exact, unadulterated imprint of the Father's very essence.
The theological weight of that is just staggering. It means if you want to know what God is like, you do not have to guess.
No guessing required. You don't have to look at natural disasters and wonder if God is capricious, or look at the silence of the cosmos and wonder if God is distant and cold.
You simply look at the character, the express image. You look at how the sun behaves in the historical accounts. You watch him healing the sick, reaching out to touch the untouchable leper, weeping openly at the tomb of a friend, and ultimately sacrificing himself.
And according to this text, when you see those actions, you are seeing the exact, perfectly replicated character of the unseen God.
Okay, so after establishing that intimate nature, the fifth descriptor swings back to cosmic mechanics. He is upholding all things by the word of his power.
And this flies directly in the face of so much modern philosophy, honestly.
Yeah, we often default to a deistic view of the universe, the idea of a clockmaker God. The belief that God wound up the intricate clock of the universe at the Big Bang, set the laws of physics in motion, and then just step back, hands off.
Just watching it tick away on its own. But the text violently rejects that clockmaker theory. The word upholding implies an active, continuous, present tense sustaining of reality.
So from the orbit of galaxies down to the strong nuclear forces holding atoms together, the universe doesn't just exist because of momentum.
Right. It exists right now in this exact millisecond because he's actively willing it to hold together by his command.
It is an intensely present view of the divine. But then descriptor number 6 brings this massive galaxy-sustaining power down to the most intimate human problem. It says he purged our sins by himself.
For a first-century Jewish audience, the concept of purging sins was deeply visceral. They knew exactly what that entailed.
It meant the bleeding of animals, the smell of blood in the temple courtyard, right?
Yes, the repetitive daily grind of the priests offering sacrifices that never permanently solved the issue of human guilt. But the text says the Son did it by himself.
He didn't use an animal surrogate. He utilized his own life, accomplishing the purification unilaterally and completely.
Which makes the final descriptor, number 7, so triumphant. After purging our sins, he sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high.
And the architectural reality of the Jewish temple provides the necessary context here, right?
It absolutely does. Inside the tabernacle and the temple, there was beautiful furniture, the golden lampstand, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, but there were absolutely no chairs.
Wait, really? No chairs at all?
None. A priest in the ancient system never sat down because his work was never finished. The blood of bulls and goats could only temporarily cover the issue, so the priest stood day after day, year after year, repeating the process.
But the Son makes one sacrifice. And then he confidently sits down on the throne of the universe. Because sitting is the universal symbol of a completed task.
The exhaustive work of cosmic purification is finished.
Wow. When you lay out those 7 points, the sheer magnitude of the claim is almost overwhelming. But I have to ask, how does this ancient cosmic resume translate to our lives today, right now?
That's the real question. We aren't first-century Jews tempted to go back to temple sacrifices.
No, but we are living in an era that is arguably suffering from the worst case of fragmented information in human history. We are drowning in a million diverse manners of advice.
Oh, totally. If you open your phone right now and look for guidance on how to live a meaningful life, you are assaulted by 1,000 contradictory gurus.
Exactly. One thought leader tells me to grind and hustle until I bleed to achieve dominance. And then the next algorithmically served video tells me to detach from all ambition, meditate, and embrace apathy. We are constantly piecing together these fragmented life hacks.
We are oversaturated with data, but completely starved for unified wisdom. We chase the next trend, the next best-selling self-help book, the next podcast, always hoping we will finally stumble upon the missing puzzle piece.
We're hoping it will suddenly make the chaos of our lives cohere into something meaningful. We are still trying to navigate with tattered, contradictory maps.
And what this text does is stand in the middle of all our modern digital noise and make a radical, grounding claim. The ultimate truth has already been spoken by the highest possible authority.
The universe is not a chaotic, meaningless void of competing voices. It has a defined center, and that center has clearly spoken.
The practical takeaway here is profound. If you actually believe this text, it means you have permission to stop frantically searching for the next big revelation.
Yes, you can step off the treadmill of information overload and start paying deep, prolonged attention to the revelation that has already perfectly illuminated the character of God.
That realization that the supreme truth has arrived is what forces the author to address the next major hurdle in the minds of his readers.
Right, because he has established the Son's identity. But to truly convince an ancient Jewish audience that this new path is superior, he has to compare the Son to the absolute highest, most majestic beings their theology could imagine.
And this brings us to a fascinating turn in the text.
Yeah, but one that I initially found really confusing, honestly. The author dedicates the rest of chapter 1 like a massive amount of ink to proving, systematically, that the Son is vastly superior to angels.
Which feels strange to us.
It feels like a massive disconnect. For a modern person living today, why angels? When I think of angels, my mind immediately goes to Renaissance paintings of chubby babies with little bird wings playing harps on fluffy clouds. Or maybe a porcelain figurine in my grandmother's house.
Right. It feels like the author is passionately arguing against a straw man. Why spend so much time on angels?
Exactly.
Well, your reaction perfectly highlights the cultural distance between us and the ancient Near East. We have entirely domesticated the concept of angels in the modern world.
We really have.
But to a first-century Jewish mind, angels were not cute, and they were certainly not decorative. They were terrifying, overwhelmingly powerful, morally pure messengers of the Almighty. When angels appeared in their ancient texts, humans didn't smile. They fell on their faces in absolute terror.
So they were basically the special forces of the divine realm.
Precisely. And more importantly, according to deep-seated Jewish tradition and corroborating New Testament texts like Stephen's speech in Acts or Paul's letter to the Galatians, the angels were intimately involved in the highest point of Jewish history.
Which was the giving of the law to Moses at Mount Sinai, right?
Yes. The law wasn't just handed over quietly. It was ordained and mediated through the ranks of these glorious, terrifying, angelic beings amidst smoke, fire, and earthquakes.
Ah, I see. So the law was sacred, not just because of what it said, but because of the majestic, transcendent couriers who delivered it.
Exactly. The angels represented the absolute zenith of communication between the Creator and humanity. So the author is employing a classic philosophical argument from the lesser to the greater.
He is essentially saying to them, you rightfully revere your ancient traditions because they were delivered by the glorious, blazing, angelic servants of God.
But those were just the servants. What if the sovereign Son himself, the creator of the angels, stepped into history to bring the new covenant?
If you revere the message of the servants, how much more absolute reverence must you have for the message of the King? It makes total sense now.
And to build this case, the author doesn't just ask them to take his word for it. He goes straight to the bedrock of their faith. He quotes their own sacred texts, primarily the Psalms and the book of 2 Samuel.
Right, and he draws this sharp, undeniable contrast between how God the Father speaks about the angels versus how he speaks to the Son.
And the analysis of those proof texts is striking. When God speaks to the angels in Psalm 104, he calls them winds and flames of fire.
So they're powerful, but they're basically forces of nature.
Yes, the text says he makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. They are phenomenal, yes. They have the power of a hurricane or a lightning strike, but fundamentally they are created instruments.
They are passive tools wielded by the hand of the Creator. They do his bidding, they fulfill their function, and they are mutable.
But when the text shifts to how the Father addresses the Son, the language elevates to a completely different stratosphere. The author quotes Psalm 45, where God the Father says to the Son, "Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever."
The Father literally addresses the Son as God, possessing an eternal throne. And then he brings in a quote from Psalm 102, which contains an insight that honestly gave me chills when I first read it, especially when viewed through a modern lens.
Psalm 102 is a fascinating text. It speaks of the foundations of the earth and the heavens being the work of his hands. But what specifically caught your attention there?
It's verses 10 through 12. The text says that the Son created the heavens and the earth, but then it makes this startling claim about the universe itself. It says, "They shall perish, but thou remainest, and they all shall wax old as doth a garment. And as a vesture shalt thou fold them up, and they shall be changed. But thou art the same, and thy years shall not fail."
It's powerful imagery.
It is. When I wrote the phrase, "wax old as doth a garment," my mind immediately went to modern physics. It went straight to the second law of thermodynamics, the concept of entropy.
The scientific principle that all closed systems inevitably move from order to disorder.
Exactly. We know now, empirically, that the physical universe is constantly decaying. It is losing usable energy. It is winding down.
The majestic stars we look up at are slowly burning through their fuel and will eventually burn out.
Right, the tallest mountains are eroding millimeter by millimeter. The universe is expanding toward an eventual heat death. And thousands of years before modern astrophysics formalized the concept of entropy, this ancient writer perfectly described a universe that is fundamentally mutable.
It is a massive, incredibly complex garment, but it is slowly, unavoidably wearing out.
The connection you're making there highlights the brilliance of the ancient text. It acknowledges the temporary, decaying nature of the physical cosmos.
But it uses that reality as a dark backdrop to highlight the blinding contrast of the Creator. While the universe is wearing out and will eventually be folded up and changed, the Son is described as completely immutable. Thou remainest.
He exists outside the system of entropy. He is eternal, unchangeable, and impervious to decay.
And so the profound argument the author is making to his readers is this: why on earth would you anchor your soul, your ultimate trust, to a religious system delivered by created angels? Beings that are merely part of the decaying, changing, created order, when you have the opportunity to anchor yourself to the unchangeable Creator himself.
Man, if we extract the principle behind that argument, it forces a deeply uncomfortable reflection for us today. I mean, we might not struggle with the temptation to worship literal winged angels.
Probably not.
But the human heart constantly struggles with the temptation to elevate lesser messengers to the status of ultimate authority.
We absolutely do. We are desperate for certainty, so we assign ultimate weight to things that are just garments wearing out.
What does those lesser messengers look like for us? It could be a political ideology that promises a utopian society. It could be a charismatic cultural influencer or a brilliant thought leader.
It could be the current fleeting moral consensus of our decade.
Or, most dangerously, it could be our own internal subjective feelings. We take these temporary, highly mutable things and treat them as if they are ultimate eternal bedrock. We build the entire structure of our lives and identities upon them.
But the text warns us that all of those things are subject to change. Political movements fail. Cultural consensus shifts radically from one generation to the next.
Our feelings change depending on what we ate for breakfast.
Exactly. If we build our foundation on the shifting cultural winds or the unpredictable flames of fire of the latest outrage cycle, we are inevitably going to be swept away when the wind changes direction.
The only safe harbor is to anchor ourselves to the thou remainest, the immutable truth of the Son.
And the terrifying reality of being swept away brings us right into the intense warning that opens chapter 2.
Right, because the author has spent all his time constructing this towering argument about how supremely high the messenger is.
Because he is not just a servant, because he is the unchangeable creator holding the universe together, the consequences of ignoring his message are correspondingly massive.
And so the narrative abruptly shifts from this soaring theological exposition into a gritty, urgent, incredibly practical warning.
Chapter 2 opens with a crucial connective word, therefore. Because of everything we just established about the Son. Therefore, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip.
Lest we let them slip. That phrase sounds so subtle, almost accidental.
The subtlety is exactly the point. The Greek concept used here is vital for understanding the nature of the warning. The phrase translated let them slip is a single Greek word, parareu.
What does that mean exactly?
It was a term often used in nautical or fluid contexts. It means to glide by, to drift away, or to leak out slowly, like water seeping from a cracked vessel.
Oh, wow. It is a chillingly passive image.
It is, because the author is diagnosing the primary way humans lose their spiritual footing. The warning here isn't aimed at active, malicious, fist-shaking rebellion.
He isn't warning them about waking up one day, looking at the sky, and consciously deciding to become an enemy of God.
Right. He is warning them about passive neglect. He is warning them about letting the most important truth in the universe simply glide past them or leak out of their lives drop by drop simply because they weren't paying close attention.
Our research sources offered an analogy for this that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. Imagine a person sitting in a small, motorless skiff on the Niagara River, maybe a mile upstream from the massive drop of the falls.
Okay, that's a terrifying mental image.
It is. The current of the river is strong and consistently moving toward the edge. For that person to be completely destroyed, they do not need to actively pick up the oars and violently, maliciously row toward the falls.
They don't have to be suicidal.
All they have to do is absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Except to pull their oars into the boat, lay back, and neglect the situation. The invisible power of the current will do all the destructive work for them.
Or consider the reality of agriculture. A farmer who wants to ruin his livelihood doesn't have to go out into his fields at midnight with a torch and actively burn his crops to the ground.
Right. To experience a devastating famine, he just has to neglect the harvest.
If he stays inside, watches the seasons pass, and simply fails to put in the hard work of reaping what was sown, ruin is the inevitable natural consequence. Simple, passive neglect is more than enough to cause an existential catastrophe.
Now, as deeply true as that is, we have to acknowledge that there is language in this passage that creates a significant obstacle for modern listeners.
Oh, absolutely. The author points back to the old angelic law and notes that every transgression receive a just recompense of reward, meaning strict, proportionate punishment.
And then he asks a haunting rhetorical question. How shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation? And if we are honest, a lot of people today fundamentally recoil at that language.
We do. We bristle at the idea of a universe that includes judgment, strict consequences, or the concept of no escape. It feels harsh.
It does feel harsh to us. And if we explore the psychology of the modern era, we can understand exactly why we resist it. We live in a cultural moment that overwhelmingly prefers a purely therapeutic view of the universe.
We deeply desire a universe that acts like a gentle, non-judgmental cosmic life coach.
Yes. We want a reality that constantly validates our choices, affirms our feelings, and never, ever holds us to an inflexible moral standard. The ancient biblical concept of a just recompense feels primitive and offensive to a therapeutic mindset.
So how do we grapple with that? Does this ancient view of severe consequences still hold value for us, or is it just a relic of a harsher time?
It holds immense, irreplaceable value, I think. What is so counterintuitive but profoundly true here is that the concept of judgment is actually the very thing that assigns ultimate weight and dignity to human life.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. Think about it. If our choices do not matter in the end, if there are absolutely no consequences to neglecting truth or embracing lies, then our lives are essentially meaningless.
A purely therapeutic universe treats humans like fragile, unaccountable children. But the biblical universe treats us like dignified, responsible moral agents whose choices possess so much gravity that they echo into eternity.
The author's logic is terrifying but sound. If this salvation is as massive, as costly, and as cosmically significant as Chapter 1 just proved it is, purchased not by angels but by the bleeding suffering of the Creator himself, then to casually ignore it is not just an oops moment.
It is an existential tragedy. It's an insult to the sheer magnitude of the gift. Imagine someone spending their entire fortune and risking their own life to secure the only existing vial of a cure for a terminal disease you have.
And they hand it to you, bleeding and exhausted.
And you just say thanks, toss it on your nightstand, and then forget to take it because you were too busy scrolling through social media or watching a sitcom.
The consequence of your death in that scenario isn't an arbitrary, mean-spirited punishment inflicted by the person who brought the cure. It is the natural, tragic result of neglecting the only remedy.
Exactly. So the question becomes one of intense practical application. How do we stop leaking this truth today? How do we avoid drifting over the falls in an environment that seems perfectly engineered to distract us?
Because our environment absolutely is engineered to make us drift. We live in an attention economy.
We are constantly bombarded by notifications, emails, 24-hour news cycles, and algorithms specifically designed by neurologists to hijack our dopamine receptors and keep us mindlessly scrolling.
The greatest spiritual danger for the modern person is rarely that they will sit down, study the arguments, and rationally disprove the truth. The far greater danger is that spiritual reality will simply glide past us unnoticed while we are completely consumed with answering mundane emails, chasing marginal career promotions, and indulging in endless, trivial digital amusements.
We leak the truth not out of spite, but because we are too fragmented and distracted to patch the vessel.
So the practice for you, the listener, is to aggressively cultivate what the text calls earnest heed. You cannot coast. You have to intentionally anchor yourself.
In a world of noise, you have to ruthlessly carve out quietness. You have to build deliberate habits, whether that is dedicated reading, deep meditation on these truths, prayer, or meaningful conversations that push beneath the surface.
You have to physically grab the oars of your skiff and row violently against the current of a culture that is perfectly content to let you passively drift over the edge.
And that concept of intentional anchoring is crucial, because we are about to need it. As we move further into Chapter 2, the author pivots from the warning to ask what might be the most profound existential philosophical question in the entire letter.
We've spent all this time establishing that the sun is supreme, high above the angels, the architect of the cosmos. The natural, burning question that follows in the mind of the reader is, where do we fit in?
What is humanity's actual place in this staggering cosmic hierarchy?
The text addresses this by quoting Psalm 8, which asks the ultimate cosmic question. What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him?
And man, bringing a modern scientific perspective to this ancient question makes it so much heavier.
Oh, completely.
When King David originally wrote that psalm 3,000 years ago, he was standing on a hillside, looking at the night sky with the naked eye. He saw maybe a few thousand stars. It was beautiful, but contained.
But when we ask that question today, we are looking at the cosmos through the lens of the James Webb Space Telescope. We are looking at deep field images that show thousands of massive galaxies in a tiny speck of sky.
We know the universe is expanding across distances that literally break our cognitive ability to comprehend. We're aware of the sheer violence of black holes and supernovas.
Against that horrifyingly vast backdrop, humanity seems like an absolutely meaningless microscopic speck of carbon dust, clinging to a fragile rock, orbiting an average star, in a forgotten, dusty spiral arm of a vast galaxy.
It induces ultimate existential vertigo. When you stare into the sheer scale of the universe, the idea that the unchangeable creator of those billions of galaxies would even notice us, let alone be mindful of us or visit us, borders on the absurd.
But the text offers a stunning, defiant answer regarding the inherent dignity of humanity. It says that God originally made humans a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor and explicitly put all things in subjection under his feet.
According to this text, humanity wasn't designed to be a meaningless accident. We were designed to be the kings and queens of the earth, crowned with dignity, appointed to rule over creation with wisdom and stewardship.
But the author is not a naive optimist. He immediately injects a dose of harsh realism into the theology. After describing this glorious original design, he writes, "But now we see not yet all things put under him."
That has to be the greatest understatement of the millennium. We look around at our actual lived experience, and we absolutely do not see humanity ruling in peaceful, glorious, sovereign dominion.
No, we see a blood-soaked history, we see brutal wars, we see pediatric cancer, we see devastating natural disasters that wipe out cities.
And perhaps worst of all, we look at ourselves and see humans who are unable to even govern their own internal passions and addictions, let alone exercise benevolent dominion over the planet.
Yes.
We are a deeply broken race living in a fractured, rebellious world.
The crown has fallen in the dirt. The dominion has been lost, or at least severely, tragically compromised.
And this realization of our brokenness is where the author executes the most brilliant pivot in the text. It is the great aha moment of this entire argument.
In verse 9, he says, humanity is failing, creation is groaning. We don't see our dominion, but we see Jesus.
But we see Jesus. Those 4 words change the entire trajectory of the human story.
They do, because what do we see when we look at him? We do not just see God, we see the ultimate perfected human. We see the second Adam fulfilling the destiny the first Adam forfeited.
We see the sovereign Son who voluntarily chose to step down from the unapproachable light, who allowed himself to be made a little lower than the angels for the specific purpose of suffering death.
I really want us to sit with the incredible honor this confers upon human nature. The divine didn't just shout a rescue plan from the safe distance of the clouds.
The creator of the James Webb Deep Field galaxies chose to physically inhabit our fragile, vulnerable, carbon-based flesh and blood. He took on our exact DNA. He experienced our hunger, our fatigue, our central nervous system.
And by doing so, by living perfectly and conquering death from the inside, he has taken human nature and elevated it to the very throne of the universe.
What's particularly fascinating, and what the author explicitly points out later in verse 16, is that he didn't take on the nature of angels to save them. The text says he completely bypassed the majestic angels to lay hold of the seed of Abraham.
He became part of our messy, broken human family.
It is genuinely mind-blowing. If you ever feel a sense of crushing insignificance because of the vastness of the universe or the anonymity of modern society, you need to remember this text.
Yes, the physical universe is unfathomably vast and terrifying. But the absolute center of authority, the throne of that universe, is currently occupied by someone who has a beating human heart.
Someone with lungs and scars who shares your exact nature. That theology elevates human dignity to a level of inherent worth that secular materialistic philosophy cannot even begin to dream of.
But that unprecedented elevation of humanity came at a horrific, unimaginable cost, which leads us directly into a concept that was incredibly offensive in the ancient world: the scandal of the suffering captain.
And this is where the text introduces an idea that feels deeply jarring. In verse 10, it says it was fitting for God to make the captain of our salvation perfect through sufferings.
Hey, hold on a second.
Right. If the Son is the exact imprint of God, the creator of the cosmos, isn't he already eternally, infinitely perfect? How can a divine being be made perfect? It sounds like a contradiction.
It's a vital question that requires us to understand the nuance of the Greek language. The word translated made perfect here is teleo. In this specific context, it does not mean moving from a state of moral flaw or sinfulness into moral perfection.
It isn't saying Jesus had to learn to be good.
Right. It means to be brought to an intended end, to be completed, or to be made perfectly qualified and fitted for a specific purpose or office.
Okay, so it's not about moral improvement. It's about vocational qualification.
Exactly. The Son was always morally flawless, but he was not yet experientially qualified to be a human savior, a merciful high priest, until he actually lived through the crushing weight of the human experience.
If the Son had come to earth, lived in a protective divine bubble, floated an inch above the dirt, never felt the agonizing throb of a headache, never wept bitterly over the grave of a friend,
never felt the sting of betrayal by someone he loved, and never faced the terror of death, he could not fully, authentically identify with the human condition.
he wouldn't be the captain. The Greek word is archegos, the pioneer, the trailblazer of our salvation. You can't be a pioneer if you refuse to step foot in the wilderness.
He couldn't lead us through the dark, terrifying valleys of human existence if he had refused to walk through them himself.
Right. Without the crucible of suffering, he could not be the complete pioneer. But we have to recognize how massively countercultural this was. We must acknowledge the obstacles to growth here.
This idea was not just confusing in the ancient world, it was deeply, violently offensive. It is what historians and theologians call the scandal of the cross.
Why was the idea of a suffering God so scandalous to them?
Because it completely contradicted the highest philosophical ideals of the time. The Greeks, heavily influenced by Stoicism and Platonic thought, believed that the ultimate defining attribute of a supreme God was apatheia, the absolute inability to feel emotion, passion, or pain.
To them, if a being could suffer, It meant that being was vulnerable to outside forces, which meant it was weak, which meant it could not possibly be God. A suffering God was pathetic.
And to the Jewish mind, a Messiah who was humiliated and crucified, which was explicitly a cursed death under the law of Moses, was a blasphemous, horrifying contradiction.
The idea of the supreme creator bleeding, crying out in raw agony, and facing public, naked humiliation shattered every preconceived expectation of what divine power should look like.
And if we look in the mirror, a lot of modern people secretly struggle with this scandal too. Deep down, we want a God of sheer, unadulterated power who just snaps his fingers from a safe distance and fixes all our problems instantly.
We don't necessarily want a God who suffers with us, but the enduring, world-changing value of this scandal is that it creates an unbreakable solidarity between the creator and the creature. Verse 11 says, because of this shared suffering, he is not ashamed to call them brethren.
If we translate this ancient model of the suffering captain into modern contexts, especially modern leadership paradigms, the contrast is absolutely stark.
In the 21st century, our standard model of power and leadership is entirely built on insulation. The higher you climb, the more insulated you become from pain.
CEOs sit in soundproof corner offices or fly on private jets, making decisions that result in massive layoffs, while the workers on the factory floor absorb the actual suffering.
Politicians and generals declare wars from secure bunkers, while other people's children are sent to fight and die in the mud. Yes. The modern goal of attaining power is to use that power to protect yourself from suffering.
But this text completely subverts and destroys that paradigm. It presents a cosmic captain who uses his supreme, unmatched power specifically to enter into the deepest, darkest trenches of human suffering alongside his people.
He doesn't lead from the rear, barking orders over radio. He grabs a shovel, jumps into the trench, and takes the first bullets.
Which brings us to the climax of this argument. Why did he jump into the trench? What was the ultimate enemy he came to face in the mud of the human experience?
The author answers this in verses 14 and 15, and it addresses the core terror of the human condition.
He came to face death. The verses say that he took on flesh and blood so that through his own death, he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage.
These have to be some of the most psychologically penetrating words ever written.
Let's unpack the theology of that briefly. It says the devil has the power of death. This does not mean Satan is some mythological lord of the underworld who holds the keys to who dies and when. God is sovereign over life and breath.
What it means is that Satan was the original tempter who introduced rebellion and sin into the human story, and death is the just, natural wages of that sin.
Satan uses the reality of death and the crushing guilt of the sin that leads to it to keep humanity paralyzed in a state of terror and spiritual slavery.
And to destroy that paralyzing power, the Son did something entirely unexpected. He didn't just banish death from afar. He used the enemy's own ultimate weapon against him. He willingly submitted to death.
By dying a completely sinless death, paying the infinite penalty for human rebellion, and then physically rising again, he essentially detonated the weapon from the inside.
He broke the finality of death, and thereby broke the power of the fear it held over us.
This is where we must bring this ancient theology crashing into the reality of our present day, because this is not just an abstract doctrinal point for a theology textbook. This is the deepest psychological diagnosis of the human race.
I cannot emphasize this enough.
Yeah.
The fear of death is the great, unspoken, underlying terror driving almost the entirety of modern human behavior. We don't talk about it at dinner parties, but people today are absolutely terrified.
We're terrified of aging. We're terrified of losing our relevance. We are terrified of the abyss. But instead of confronting it, we build massive defense mechanisms.
We drown the fear in frantic busyness. We work 80-hour weeks to build massive stock portfolios and wealth that we cannot possibly take with us. We obsess over fitness routines, organic diets, and anti-aging treatments, desperately trying to turn back the clock.
We numb the existential dread with substances, with endless traveling, with constant entertainment. We will do anything, spend any amount of money to avoid sitting in a quiet room and confronting the terrifying reality of our own mortality.
The cultural anthropologist Ernest wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Denial of Death, in which he argued that almost all of human culture, ambition, and heroics are fundamentally just a massive, elaborate defense mechanism designed to help us cope with the unbearable knowledge that we are going to die.
The author of Hebrews diagnosed this psychological bondage 2,000 years before Becker. We are, as verse 15 says, subject to bondage. We are slaves to the fear of the end.
But the profound wisdom offered here provides literal psychological deliverance from that slavery. If the captain of our salvation has already walked through the terrifying door of death, experienced its darkness, and come out the other side victorious.
And if he now holds the keys, then that door is no longer a drop into a dark, meaningless abyss. It is a passage. It is a transition.
You no longer have to live your life frantically building sandcastles of denial. You can face your mortality with a deep, grounded peace.
And that profound peace leads to the final, deeply comforting conclusion of chapter 2. Because Jesus took on flesh, because he was tempted, because he suffered, he is uniquely qualified to be a merciful and faithful high priest.
The Greek term the author uses in verse 17 for making reconciliation or atonement is hilaskomai. Is a heavy word. It means to propitiate, to turn away wrath, or to make God propitious toward us by dealing definitively with our sins.
He bridged the infinite, terrifying gap between a holy God and a broken humanity. He dealt with the objective problem of our guilt, but he also deals with our subjective daily pain.
Because he walked through the grid of the human experience, verse 18 says, "For in that he himself hath suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted."
That word succor is a beautiful Old English word. The Greek behind it means to run swiftly to the aid of someone who is crying out for help.
So, after this massive cosmic journey we've taken today, here's the deeply personal, practical question for you listening to this right now. When you face the inevitable crises of life, when you are hit with overwhelming anxiety, when you are wrestling with a dark temptation that you are ashamed of,
When you feel the crushing, suffocating weight of a personal failure, or when the looming dread of your own mortality creeps into your thoughts at 2 a.m. and you can't sleep, where do you actually turn?
do you turn to some modern Stoic philosophy that tells you to just detach your emotions, toughen up, and ignore the pain? Do you turn back to the distractions of your phone?
Or do you turn to the high priest who has actively, physically felt the exact same crushing weight, the same isolation, the same temptation you are feeling right now?
A God who intimately knows what it's like to weep, to bleed, and to feel utterly abandoned in the dark.
The contrast for the listener is clear. A philosophy, a life hack, or a distraction can give you temporary coping mechanisms. It can numb the pain for a night. But only a sympathetic, victorious high priest, a suffering captain who has conquered death, can give you true succor and ultimate rescue.
As we finally wrap up this massive, deep exploration of Hebrews 1 and 2, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We've talked about how angels, these terrifying, majestic beings, are essentially assigned as ministering spirits to aid the heirs of salvation, as the very end of chapter 1 notes.
And we've talked extensively about how the physical, fragile human form has been permanently elevated to the right hand of the majesty on high in the person of Jesus.
If both of those staggering realities are true, if unseen, powerful angelic beings are currently deployed to serve humanity, and if the human nature is currently occupying the throne of the universe, how much immense, inherent, breathtaking value does every single human life possess?
That theology demands a complete revolution in how we view the people around us.
It changes absolutely everything. How should that truth alter the way you treat the exhausted cashier at the grocery store today? How does it change your patience with that incredibly frustrating coworker?
How does it reframe the way you look at the marginalized stranger sitting across from you on the subway tomorrow morning?
You are not looking at highly evolved, meaningless clumps of cells. You are looking at a creature whose exact nature the creator of the universe adopted, bled for, and crowned with glory. You are looking at someone for whom angels are ministering.
As C.S. Lewis once said, there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal.
Think back to the transition we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive. We don't have to navigate the dark, muddy waters of life using fragmented, tattered maps anymore. We aren't forced to piece together faint rumors of the divine from burning bushes and dreams.
The ultimate map has been handed to us. The sun is spoken, the fog is completely cleared, and the sun is at high noon.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.